Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. Today with us is Brin Žvan, and we are in week 10 of Game Production Masterclass. And today we'll be talking about vertical slices. But before we start with vertical slices and before Brin takes it off, there are just like few housekeeping things to do. First, I would like to thank again all of our partners and sponsors on this project. First of all, Centar za Kreativnost, and this project is also part of this platform and is co-financed by European Union and Republic of Slovenia, and also to our sponsors, Outfit 7 and Triternion, who are one of the biggest companies in Slovenian's games industry, and also Reveris, who's our partner from the beginning. And yeah, that's all that we'll thank. And just to say a few words about homework, today you will get revised homework from Josh about prototyping, and Said already started doing his revision on your homework. And as always, there will be a link to notes where you can like take notes while this lecture is going on, and all of the other information will be on the Discord later. And yeah, and how this whole lecture will look like. Brin will have like 1 hour of like lecture, and then in the end we will have a Q&A session where he will answer all of your questions, which will be posted via chat feature here on YouTube. Okay, so I don't know. I think that I introduced Brin like many times, and I don't know what to say about him. He is a student at ITU in Copenhagen, and he's an indie developer and done like many game jams, like from 1 hour to 48 hours to 1 week to 1 month. His games are posted in some zines, yeah, he really is inspirational. He really like loves what he does. He loves to explore like game design and how to like bring interactive experiences and like experimental art to like new forum. And I think that today he will like tell like I think something core, like how to make a vertical slice, like what goes into it, what should you put in it, what should not, what you should do, and this will be just like kind of like extension of prototyping. So I think you will enjoy this, and Brin, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Rock. Thanks for the warm introduction as well. So I will repeat some of Rock's words. You guys should be able to see my screen now, but I will go, first of all, give you a little bit of a preamble, because I think context is important regardless of what we're talking about, and especially when it comes to something as immensely diverse as game development. I watched some of the previous lectures, and I really liked Josh's first prototyping lecture, where he said that he's an indie developer whose highest funding that he have received was $10,000, and that apparently somebody else, as a part of this lecture series, said that like if you don't get at least $10,000, you should not even prototype, whereas that was his budget, right? So that gives you just like a good overview of how different game developers can be and how different game development as a practice is. So let's give you the context of me. Who am I? Like Rock said, I am finishing a Master's of Science in Games at IT University in Copenhagen. I mostly make indie arcade games. These are small, always so far self-published titles. Some of them are made for profit, and these are experiences that last 2 to 4 hours. And some are made for the sake of art, for the sake of creating video games, and for the sake of exploring what is possible within the mediums. Even though some of this, all of these things are self-published, sometimes there are external actors involved in this. And as we will see with vertical slices, a lot of times vertical slices can be used to present yourself to external sources. So I do have some experience pitching my games to publishers and to investors and to different platform holders. But I cannot tell you, for example, what is the experience like with vertical slices when you have a publisher breathing down your neck, telling you that you need to deliver a vertical slice of a game in 2 months. I can only tell you what it's like when working within smaller teams. Or I can tell you, especially I'm highlighting this one, what for me a vertical slice means when most of the games and most of the works that I do are just made for the sake of art, for the sake of exploring the medium. So that's a little bit about me. Let's go into the agenda. What are the things that we're gonna talk about? We're gonna first talk about what are vertical slices, then why we should make a vertical slice. Like, what is the use of even having that? What to put into a vertical slice when we're finally making it, and then we will go over homework. Throughout this lecture, we will go over a few case studies. One of them is going to be One Button Bosses, a video game that I'm currently working on because it is dear to my heart and because I know it and I can analyze it. And another one is going to be a Mega Man inspired FPS that was released a few years ago, if I recall correctly. But there's also, before we get to the homework, we're going to go into a section about why vertical slices suck and why we should maybe not consider doing them. Because I think it's important to recognize why dominant structures inside of the mediums or inside of the societies that we are participating in exist. And we should not always take something as positive, even if it's always presented as positive. There are negatives to it as well, and I want to dedicate like 10 minutes of our time to discussing if it even makes sense for you to make a vertical slice. So let's talk about what are vertical slices, right? And to understand vertical slices, we need to understand the layers that a game is made out of. I'm gonna 2 times through this lecture analyze video games and try to give you like a breakdown on a video game. And I just want to put a preface here as well that this is a very oversimplified version of what video games are made out of. Video game analysis, and systems to analyze video games are tools, and we're just using them as a tool to better understand vertical slices in this case. And first, we're gonna start with, technically speaking, looking at a game. Like, what is a game made out of? A game is made out of systems. A system can be anything that you say that you put into a game that supports different things, right? Like, let's say that we want a character that is moving around. That is a system. Let's say that we say have enemies. That is a system, right? You can have multiple different enemies, but there's like some overarching, like some parent system that they all belong to. It's like a category of things that you have. Here's a few of them in like a very traditional game. We could say that movement, combat, enemy AI, levels, multiplayer, sounds, high scores, right? Destructible terrain. This would all be systems. And this is like very video gamey examples that I'm giving to you. And if we veer towards like more experimental video games, we always have something that we can say, point at and say, this is a system inside of this video game. We could say that like art generation is a system. We could say that having a custom hardware controller is a system. We could say that having multiple endings is a system. We could say like if you can only play 1 turn per day, that is a system, right? Anything that is facilitating some sort of gameplay, but then requires content to be created for it, right? That is a system. So again, if we look at some examples, if we say we need a sound system, we need some way to play sounds inside of our game, right? And we make a system for playing sounds, and we make a system for playing music, and we make a system for fading out the music, right? These are all systems, but they require elements. They require something to fill the systems with, to give them the content. And if we look at a very generic first-person shooter, we could say our system is the weapons and the shooting. And let's look at the elements. The elements of this shooting could be a shotgun. It could be a sniper rifle. It could be an automatic gun, right? So we have this system of having a gun and being able to shoot it. And then we vary inside of it with saying a shotgun shots 2 bullets at a time, and then you need to reload it. A sniper rifle has the option of giving you a scope so that you can look through it. An automatic gun, you don't need to reload it. It's gonna like keep going for a long time, and you will keep firing. Or we can say steer away from that and still stay inside of the weapon and the combat system and say, actually, let's give a player a melee weapon, which will function differently than a shotgun would or a sniper rifle would, but it is still something that the player uses within the combat system to fight against enemies. Also, just a note, neither Rock nor me mentioned this. I forgot about it. But if anybody has questions, feel free to throw them in the chat during the presentation itself, and we'll tackle them later. And now I actually have like a case study of a video game. One of the research notes that Rock posted is a blog post that is trying to explain what vertical slices are. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a little task that is also done inside of that blog post, where we're going to watch a video, a gameplay video, and I want you all to note down whether you see something inside of this game that presents itself as its own system, right? So if you see anything inside of this video that you think this is a system, I want you to write it down. The video is about 2 minutes long, and it's a first-person shooter. So let's look at it. And after we look at it, we are going to go and compare my notes, your notes, or like you will be able to compare your notes against my notes. And then we will also compare them against the person that wrote the original blog post where this video is analyzed. So that we'll be able to see the diversity in how we can see systems. But let's look at this video. There's sound. I'm not sure like if the sounds will go through, but honestly, they're not important for you to be able to take notes and look at what are the different systems inside of the video. So let's see if it plays. Oh. Oh. Sorry. What is this? Let's try playing it again. No. There we go. Okay. Okay, so that was like the game. Let's look over my notes. I have noted down 6 different systems. I've noted down the cinematic system, which we have seen at the very start. There is player movement, which we have seen different kinds of throughout the video. the combat system, so the player being able to shoot, where again we have seen different kinds of combat that the player engaged in, the enemy AI, which again we have seen different kinds of, and cinematic and combat transitions. There were a few points inside of the video where you could see that the player jumped onto an enemy directly from the gameplay, and we could see like this little cinematic of them taking a weapon from the enemy or something along those lines. And the last system is the Destructible Terrain, right? To look at a few more concrete examples of the elements inside of this system, right? Inside of the player movement system, we saw at first the player moving normally through like a character controller that is bipedal, right? Through like trying to control a character. There was dashing inside of that movement system. At some point, you could see the player jumping onto an elevated platform, like that, dashing towards it and losing some stamina. There was a section where they were free falling. That is also like a restricted movement system. The movement rules were different there than they are when the player is moving on the ground. And inside of the combat system, for example, we saw two different types of guns, which look like they play in a similar way, and something that plays in a completely different way, which is a grenade, right? Which is very different in its usage than Gun 1 or Gun 2 were. Inside of enemy AI, for example, we saw some of the drones towards the end, which were kind of just floating there, and the player had to avoid them or shoot them earlier enough. Or we saw the semi-intelligent AI at the start, which was actually trying to target a player and shoot at the player, right? So these are kind of like some elements within these systems that we were able to see. I want to highlight what the developer from the blog that is in the resources section of the Masterclass Discord pointed out the systems. One, because I partially disagree with some of the things being systems that they point out, but also because it shows granularity and the idea that like what we see as a system can be very different from person to person. This is the thing like straight out from the blog post, right? So there's the in-game cinematic transitions. I also had that. First-person shooter type running gun sequences, right? Like I'm not really sure what they mean by this. I think it's like the movement that they're referring to. Charge-up weapon attack, right? So they are referring to having like a charge-up attack as a system that you could have multiple variations of. Activatable melee combat kill animation sequences, right? And specifically inside of one of these ones, which one is it? On number 7, variation gameplay on cinematic kills. They specify that like this is a system that has variation inside of it. There are cinematic kills, but you can have different animations playing, right? So that we could consider the animations different elements of a system. I personally think this is too granular to go inside of a system to classify it as a system, but we could look at this as a system if we wanted to. There's alternative methods of traversing geometry. That's the dash, right? Thrown grenade having effects on the environment, right? You could have destructible environment, but it could also be affected by other things than just the thrown grenade. So this is not just like a one-off thing. We could consider like the destructible environment a system on its own, and so on, right? Like you can compare my more generalized look at the systems and their more granular look at the systems that are here. And maybe like you also wrote down just a few things. Maybe you wrote down multiple things. Maybe you're super familiar with the game like this guy is, or you're watching the video in the background now and you're able to spot more things, right? But these are kind of like the different systems that we have inside of video games. And when we have all of these systems, a vertical slice is essentially a portion of a game that features all of the systems, or as many systems as possible. But it also features the minimum amount of elements to represent these systems, right? Inside of the video, we saw a bunch of different systems. I am sure that level 1 of the game, which like this was a cut version of like different levels, right? But level 1 of the game does not feature a free falling sequence, jumping onto enemies, stealing their guns, right? Like it is probably simpler because throwing all of these ideas at the player is overwhelming, and a vertical slice should not be confused with a demo, because a vertical slice just takes all of the systems and provides some elements within them so that we can play with them and we can and that we can use them. But we'll talk about like usages of vertical slices later. But let's have a little intervention first, Because with this definition, it is kind of lacking, or like it doesn't really tell us like that the game is more than just its gameplay programming. There's no mention of sound, there's no mention of graphics, feel, animations. And the idea kind of is, when we're using the systems analysis, is that all of these things are their own systems. The sounds are a system, the animations are a system, the game feel, it's a part of a system, right? Like making different things juicy, that's like the part of the juice system, and making graphics, that's a part of the graphic system that we have for a game, right? So when we are considering a vertical slice, do not think only in the gameplay system that we're analyzing and pointing out here, right? Because these are the things that are easy to spot for us as game designers. Remember that there is other things to the game, other systems, such as graphics and feel and animations and sound, right? Because a vertical slice, it's supposed to be kind of like a finished game. Let's take a look at a case study. Let's look at since we're already in the field of FPS games, let's look at a few systems that we could have inside of a first-person shooter. Let's say that we have a movement system. You could have character movement, you could have movement inside of a tank, and movement inside of an airplane. We could have combat systems where we have different types of guns for the player to use, or different types of weapons. We could have different levels, different maps to play the game on. And we could have different game modes to play the game at. Why we call a vertical slice is because it takes like the vertical approach, right? Like we are not going to develop a rifle and a sniper rifle. We will develop the combat system and its bare basics, and we will make one or two type of guns for it. And then on top of all of this, we will also say, let's add all of the art, let's add all of the sounds, let's add all of the music. Because a vertical slice is supposed to be a finished version of the game. It's like taking 10 minutes of gameplay from a done game, from something that you have completed that you're not touching ever again, and working on those 10 minutes, right? If you play level 3.5 of Doom, that is a vertical slice in a sense, because you do not see the context around it. You do not see level 3.6, you do not see level 3.4, you just see level 3.5, and level 3.5 can be a good representation of what are the systems inside of Doom. You have multiple different enemies inside of it. You have the lighting system when it comes to the graphics. You have guns. You have health pickups. You have secrets, right? You have all of the elements of a classic Doom game, of a classic Doom map, but they are contained inside of a single level. Now let's talk about why would it be useful to make any sort of vertical slices, right? Like why would I go and do this strip of content? Why should I not do all types of guns at the same time? Why should I not like do level design at the same time? So there are two types of uses that I would say that apply to vertical slices. The first one would be internal usage, so something that is used within the theme and something that you as the developer find useful. And another part is an external usage, which is more related to marketing and showing the game to other people. When it comes to internal things, we could say, like I noted down a few things like validation, system blending, playtesting value, feature freezing, and scope defining. I think these are the bullet points for me, the main uses for a slice, and these are the uses that we're using in our project One Button Bosses. That's why we're using the vertical slice for. And let's talk about them. But all of them kind of can be summed up by just saying, oh, it's for validation. But validation means like very few things, right? When I say system blending, I mean or like validation can mean many things, which is why I will like give you examples here. Like we can validate if the systems are blending well together. We can say we want to do capture the flag game mode, and we want to have very characters that dash a lot and have a lot of movement abilities. Okay, let's see if that actually works together. Like it works in my head, right? But if we do a vertical slice and we have an idea of what kind of a feeling we want to capture, we can actually and what kind of movement systems we want the character to have and what kind of gameplay they want to have, we can actually see if this stuff works together. We can actually see if doing a cartoony FPS that has very mobile characters where you're playing capture the flag as the main game mode, if all of these systems that we're presenting actually blend together and actually work together. Because oftentimes you could just say, oh, this is like, you could just be developing the guns and you could say, wow, the guns feel amazing. This is fantastic. let's take them into capture the flag. Let's make a capture the flag game around these maps. And then you're actually playing with the guns, and you see that the guns do not facilitate any sort of movement options. And you see that these two systems do not blend together very well. They do not create unique, or they do not create enjoyable gameplay. Vertical slices also provide us with playtesting value. Josh talked about playtesting and creating prototypes before in the prototyping series a bit, if I recall correctly. But vertical slices present a different kind of playtesting value because you have a part of a finished product. Like we said, a vertical slice is kind of like a 10-minute section of a game. And if you want to see if people actually enjoy it, or how, again, all of the systems work together, we can give this to somebody to playtest, and they can actually play it, and we can say, wow, okay, they did feel like they're in an epic space opera. And all of these things do, like both the gameplay, the graphics, the music, all of these things work together towards creating this sort of an environment and this sort of a vibe. So that is good. Let's keep it that way. Or you can see that like something is off and that you need to change something, right? And that you need to go back to the point of making a vertical slice or prototyping some ideas, and that's when you need to that's the thing you need to iterate on. And then two more things: feature freezing and scope defining. These two kind of go hand in hand, but it's the idea that systems are kind of like features, right? Like we say, we're going to have guns, and now we have a gun system, or we're going to have multiple movement systems for the player, and now we have multiple movement systems, right? So when you are building different kinds of movement systems, you will want to set a base, right? And you're creating this as a feature, and then you can create content within it. And it allows you to like stop on the features and just say, okay, we're done with features now. Now we're just making levels and art for those levels. But because we know that we will not do like, we will not have a water breathing system, we are not doing an underwater level where players have to breathe, right? Like it gives you sort of a box to work inside of. And scope defining, by scope defining, we simply mean that when you're building systems, systems are often, at least technically speaking, when it comes to technical proficiency, something that tests your team, something that tests your abilities, whether you're able to actually deliver like on the technical programming side. Can you build a weapon system where you can swap weapons? And can you create art that actually fits the vibe and the thing that you're going for, right? Like it is testing you on all of the levels. And that kind of lets you scope things a lot more easily, because if you see like, actually, we are not able to create like a Egyptian vibe where you are like a Tomb Raider or whatever. Maybe we should cut down on some of these aspects, because either like our enemy AI does not very well work with creating this sort of a vibe. Maybe if we went for something more mindless, like working with mummies as an enemy instead of like a mastermind villain that requires a very complex AI, we can make a game. But this is something that you will see once you develop a system, and once you see like if the system or the art or sounds or whatever, right? Like if it's fitting the style that you're going for, works or not. And doing this vertical part allows you to see that. Whereas if you just went like more ground level, like if you just did one thing at a time, or just focus first maybe on weapons and did a little bit of weapons and then did a little bit of levels, and then you finally put them together after a few months, you might find out that this doesn't work. And you will find out later down the line when you have already, I don't want to say wasted, but you kind of waste the time developing something that you don't know if it works. And then for external usage, it's kind of like always boils down to money. We'll talk about that like a little bit more later, because it's simple. All of these things here, all of this is about imagination. All of this is about perception of the video game that you are creating. Inside of internal usage, we could say that this is kind of like a North Star principle. Like a vertical slice, it's something that you can look up to and have it guide you. If you have a slice of a game, if you have like the 10 minutes of Max Payne from like somewhere in the middle, you could say we kind of want the rest of the game to feel like this. We just need to create the content, right? And then whenever you're unsure for what kind of feeling you're going for what kind of things work, if you know that your vertical slice works, you can always look at your vertical slice and try to iterate on the ideas that you're presenting there. Or ask yourself, well, why does something that we created that is new does not work? because it's easier to imagine what the rest of the game will look like when and feel like and play like, and what the rest of the game will be like to program when you have a benchmark for it, when you have something to show already. And because boundaries breed creativity, because when creating some sort of a box, when we tell to ourselves, we are only going to have gun weapons, which will all function on a reloading system, where all of the maps that we will have are going to be built like with this tool that allows us to only create flat maps, right, and not vertical maps. That's when you have boundaries. And these are like, the boundaries are the systems that you are working within. And when you have those systems set, it's going to become easier for you to realize how to subvert those the expectations inside of those systems, how to create something interesting. Whereas if you're just kind of like exploratory prototyping all the time, that's when you can very easily get lost inside of different ideas without exploring them, right? Without actually going deeper into them. And these boundaries are what is going to make you create things, because the vertical slice defines the box, and inside of the box you are now free to create whatever. You do not need to set up the box anymore. And when it comes to external part, when it comes to the my part, right, I have this quote from a friend of mine that I really like. Investors are just players with money. And the key part here is that investors, and when we say investors, we're roughly talking about publishers, investors, platform holders, whatever, right? Like, they are players. They are not game developers. They might have been game developers. They might be in the future game developers. They might be familiar with how the game development process works. But at the end of the day, they are players. And by that, I mean, they do not have the eternal knowledge of the video game that you are creating in the same way that you do. This is kind of similar to the whole mantra, you might have heard it, that if the game is too easy for you, if it's way too easy for you, then it's probably the right difficulty for somebody else. Because every other player that is going to play the game that is not you, every other player will not play the game in the same way that you will, because they will not have the whole preconceived context for the game in the same way that you did. They did not spend 3 months developing it, right? So they do not have the skills, they do not have the pre-required context and knowledge to imagine what are the other things you could make inside of this video game, right? So that is why with like a vertical slice, we can show to an investor something that is cool, something that is finished, right? And they can play that thing, or they can see like a video reel or whatever of the vertical slice, and they can imagine now what the rest of the game looks like, kind of in the same way that it's easier for us, the developers, to imagine what are the other ways that we can be flexible inside of this. It's easier for them to see the final product when you present them the vertical slice. And it's kind of because the vertical slice is supposed to be the final product, right? It is supposed to be something that is almost there, almost finished. Now let's look at a case study. The case study for this time is going to be One Button Bosses. It is a game that I'm working on, that I have been working on for the past year and 2 months-ish, on and off. It is a commercial project. It is coming out on Steam. It's actually a part of Steam's Going Rogue festival that is going on right now, and you can download a demo as a part of that festival. And it's also going to come out on Nintendo Switch. But anyway, let me pitch the game to you, because you need to understand a little bit of the game to be able to understand the context around this. One Button Bosses is a game, like the name implies, where you fight bosses with one button. And to do this, we have like this very simple system where we have a spaceship that is automatically traveling around the circle, and you can press one button, and when you press that one button, the direction that you are orbiting changes. So it's kind of about avoiding these red enemy attacks. But since it's about a boss fighting game as well, it is not just about avoiding things, it is also about shooting enemies. And as you're moving, if you're moving in one direction for a longer period of time, you shoot at an enemy. And the longer you move in one direction, the faster your shooting is going to be. So you kind of have this dynamic of like, you want to go in one direction, but you want to avoid the attacks that are in that direction, but you don't want to stop moving because change directions, because if you change directions, that means that you are going to lose on your damage output, and it's going to be harder to defeat the boss. This is kind of like what a more complex level inside of one button bosses can look like. Know that you have a basic idea of the game. It's there's a lot of things happening at the same time in the game. There's a lot of things that you have to track of, even though it has a very simplistic system. And as you might see, like between these two videos, right, there are different color palettes. So we have graphics that are different from one level to another, and we have different movement systems. We could move on a circle, or we can move on a square, and so on, right? So if we break one button bosses down into these systems, we can kind of break it down into something like this. We have different ways for the player to move, which is not really shown like on any of the GIFs that I showed you. And maybe I should have like chosen better GIFs for that. But like we have a way for the player to move. We have a way for the player to fire at an enemy. We have we have movement patterns with what kind of shape the player is moving in. And we have the levels of the bosses and the attacks that they are firing off. And let's say that like in a full game, we want to have 20 levels. Let's say that we want the player to be able to move on 4 different shapes: a circle, a square, a triangle, and a line. And we have 3 different attack systems. Maybe we have like the auto-firing one that I showed you before. We have a boomerang where you kind of need to catch it to be able, like you need to catch a bullet that bounces off the boss to be able to throw it again and to attack the boss. We have pick-up-ables that can increase and change your attacks. And we have a laser where, like, if you're in bottom left quadrant of the map, sometimes you make stronger attacks, and sometimes if you're in the top left quadrant of the map, you make stronger attacks. And then we also have different movement systems. We have the direction changing, but what if instead of changing directions, we have something where you dash over enemy attacks, or something where you spawn a clone that you would teleport to 3 seconds afterwards, right? So it's probably hard for you to imagine some of these things. And that's something that I'll get to in a little bit, and different ways of tackling vertical slices. But a traditional vertical slice kind of looks like this, right? We give one element out of the movement system, we take one element out of the attack system, one out of the movement patterns, and we create one level that the player has to play through. And then we add the art and the music and the sounds on top of this, and we have a vertical slice. However, the vertical slice that we actually ended up using in production, and that has actually been more useful for us both internally and externally, kind of looks like this, right? And I will explain why a vertical slice should kind of include more than just a single element of every single system, or why a vertical slice should be deeper through loops, through gameplay loops. And we need to understand gameplay loops to understand why vertical slices should be wider. So let's again look at our friend, the game. And let's like kind of designerly speaking, break down the game into 2 different loops. And again, there's a bunch of like gameplay loops, like micro, moment to moment, minute to minute, that you can find. This is a bit different. We're just gonna break a game down into a meta loop and a gameplay loop, right? A gameplay loop is the verbs, it's the core actions that define the player experience, right? Are you in a platform? Then it's probably going to be jumping and avoiding and running, right? Are you in a racing game? It is going to be racing and overtaking other race cars and taking turns. And then we have the meta loop. The meta loop is the thing that forces the player to engage with the core gameplay loop. It is the structure that we create around the game that forces us to interact with the systems that we are providing it. So if we're, say, are looking at Forza, a racing game, as an example, the gameplay loop, like I said, it's speeding up, it's taking turns, it's overtaking other racers. The meta loop is a race. The meta loop, like a literal loop, the meta loop is a race. It's the like tourneys. It's the idea of actually having like a structure, like creating a structure for why you as the player might want to drive around and race. Important thing to know is that meta loops can also just be that you are free to do whatever you want, right? Like in some sort of simulator games, in like open world exploration games, a meta loop is something that facilitates like the openness of the game. So that's kind of going to be like our understanding of a game through loops. Let's look at like 2 video games as examples so we can better understand this. Super Mario Brothers, very iconic game. You probably played it, or you have seen somebody play it at some point in your life, whether on YouTube, but like everybody should kind of have the understanding of this, right? maybe try to write down what you think the gameplay loop of it is and what you think the meta loop of it is. The gameplay would be running, jumping, platforming, powering up. And I would define the meta loop as completing a level and going to the next level, right? I would say that this is what the loop for Mario is. Let's look at a very different game than Super Mario. Let's analyze the gameplay loop before we go to the next game, let's look at how the meta loop, like completing a level and going to the next level, it is the thing that is forcing us to engage with the gameplay, right? Like the fact that you have like some sort of timer in Mario that is ticking down and camera that is like pushing you towards the right. That is the thing that's like forcing you, let's go to the next level. Let's use all of these verbs that we are allowing you as the player to do. And the fact that you are playing the game and that you are doing these verbs can make you already imagine like what are the next things that you're going to be doing inside of the next level. You're not completing levels just for the sake of finishing the game. You're completing the levels for the sake of getting to the next level and being able to perform the same verbs in different ways on the next level, right? The meta loop is the thing that is allowing the gameplay to exist. If we look at Settlers of Catan, a board game, but a game nonetheless, the gameplay loop would be building and trading things. That is the gameplay loop that it has. And the meta loop would be taking turns, right? Because it is taking turns and throwing dice that facilitates this thing that you remember Settlers of Catan for. You remember that one time where your friend ended up screwing you over by not being willing to trade any of the clay, and they hogged all of the clay from the map, right? But this is only allowed through the fact that we are taking turns and that we are actually playing the game, that we're making the game progress, and that we're inviting variation inside of this gameplay, right? If it is just like you just throw the dice once, you will not be able to do a lot of the gameplay. You need sort of like this meta loop that is forcing you to get to the gameplay part multiple times. And we could like go further up if we wanted with Settlers of Catan, and we could say like, what is the meta gameplay loop of this? And we could just say it's multiple games. It's the fact that like you can play another game of Settlers of Catan, and because of the fact that there are multiple strategies that people can take, and that there's randomization elements inside of how the map is composed, and in what kind of resources you're going to be getting, that every game is different. So you are creating a different gameplay experience every time. So the vertical slice, as we have seen it before, right? When I pull down like just the one red line on this slide, I should have duplicated this slide and put it back in, right? But on this single slide, one second. The vertical slice implies only a singular meta loop, right? A single thing. You're going to play through one level with one ability over one attack, right? Systems will often rely on multiple elements inside of them to really shine. You can play through Doom only using the default gun. But that is not really where the weapon system inside of Doom shines. It shines when you have to swap between the weapons. It shines when you have the context of the gun actually being weaker compared to a shotgun. So there is implication for you to try to get the shotgun, right? When we see the relationships between the systems, that's when it's also easier to imagine what kind of elements we can create that are different from the current elements. When we have a vertical slice that looks like this, when I can see the variation between level 2 and level 3, when I can see that there's completely different attacks inside of them, that's when it becomes easier for me to imagine some other attacks, especially if I am an external actor, right? Because like I said before, external actors, external people do not come with the mountains of thinking that you have done about your video game, with the mountains of time that you have spent with it, right? You may show them the first level of Super Mario Bros., but they may not imagine that you could put wings on a Goomba and make the Goomba fly within that game, right? It is easier to imagine that when you can actually show them that there is variation inside of the enemies as well, that you can have also turtles for the enemies, right? It is easier for somebody to imagine, well, if we have a circle and a square movement pattern, why don't we try a triangle? Or why don't we try a line, right? Or that when you have different kinds of player attacks, that you can that you could actually like variate inside of this, in our case, very simple looking system of the player just auto firing at the enemy. Just like as a personal experience, like as a personal anecdote, I have been in 2 meetings with the same company for one button bosses, where we were trying to pitch the game to them to try to get on their platform. And in the first meeting, we had a vertical slice in the purest definition of a vertical slice. We had one ability that the player could use to move. It was just the direction changing. We only had the auto firing. We only had the circular movement pattern, and we only had one level that the player could play through. It was everything extremely polished. There was final art that we are still using to this day inside of the project. There was final music that we are still to this day working on using inside of the project. Final visual effects, right? It was all done as a vertical slice. It was finished in a way, like the vertical slice was finished. However, and I had a lot of ideas for like how to extend this, and other people on the team had a lot of ideas on how to do different elements. However, when you're pitching this to somebody, it is a bit harder for them to imagine, right? Like I had PowerPoint slides and I was showing them like sketches and little drawings of how a boomerang is going to work, where you're gonna shoot a boomerang onto the boss, and then you're gonna have to catch it. Otherwise, you will have to wait a little bit for it to recharge. So you will need to more dynamically move, right? And we're gonna have a square, right? But it's a lot harder to imagine that this variation when you just see it like on a PowerPoint slide, and it's also harder to believe that this kind of variation is something that we, as the developers, are technically able to create. So I would say that no, it shouldn't be the minimum amount of elements. It should be the minimum amount of elements plus one, or the minimum amount of elements that make your systems shine, right? That make your systems easier to get the mind going and easier to imagine. So hopefully that kind of clears up why it would be useful for us to have a vertical slice, because it provides us a guiding star, because it gives us the idea, the imagination of where we should, what kind of things we should be creating. And because vertical slices allow us, to create this box for ourselves to be in and to like define the game for ourselves. But because we're trying to define it, and because it's all about imagination, vertical slices are all about creating an easier time for us and for external actors to imagine things. We should be putting in not just one element, but a bit more than one element. So when should you be creating a vertical slice? I will give two like very non-answers. I wanted to include this because I feel like it is a question that will come up in the chat if I do not try tackling it. But I will preface with this with there is no right answer, right? So let me give you a generalized, precise answer. You do prototyping. Then after prototyping, you might go and do funding, right? And you might get funding, and the funder will ask you, could I get a vertical slice so you can prove to me that you are able to do this? They might not ask you this, right? Or you might not get funding. And then because either your investors or publishers or whatever ask you to do a vertical slice, you do a vertical slice. Or you haven't been able to get funding purely from the prototype. Now you can still, if you still believe in the prototype, you can still go into the vertical slice. And you can still tell yourself, I will try to make this like experience more presentable, because prototypes usually lack in that regard. They usually do not feel like finished products, and a vertical slice feels, or at least should feel, like a finished product. And that makes it a lot easier to try to get funding with it, because you are not selling people the idea, the promise of a game. You are selling them your technical abilities of being able to create something, and you're telling them, let me create more of this, right? Or you could just like ignore funding altogether if it's something that you're doing purely for yourself as a hobby, and you could just do the prototyping, you just do the vertical slice, and use the vertical slice then, like I said, as a guiding star for yourself internally. And then you finish the game, right? This is a very oversimplified way of how game development works, but basically a vertical slice comes after prototyping if we want to have a precise answer. Now here is a vague and a more descriptive answer, because the prototyping phase is very vague, and it's very hard sometimes to draw the line where we say, this is enough of prototyping. You do a vertical slice when you need to log down your systems on where you, or when you are seeking funding and you're not able to get funding with the prototype, right? This doesn't really answer the question of when you should do it, because I cannot tell you should do it 3 months after you're in development, right? Because like I said before at the very start, context is king in game development. It is very different if I'm making a game alone or if I'm making a game with 3 people, let alone if I'm making a game with 30 people. The context is going to define when you're going to need a vertical slice. But this is kind of like you can use this as a guiding principle for when you should be working on a vertical slice. We're about 45 minutes in, which means it's time for me to talk about why you should not do a vertical slice to end this presentation. But I'm going to take a sip of water before I run out of air, or like before I run out of talking abilities. Okay. I want you to imagine that you're doing a painting. Whether you're a painter, whether you have ever painted in your life or not, I want you to do a painting. And I want you to imagine yourself doing a painting. You do a little tiny sketch. And then you pick a spot of the painting and you start going all fucking in on that spot. This is the painting that you made. This is a vertical slice. It is the idea that you do a sketch and then you take one piece of the sketch and you make it final. However, if you ever painted, you will know that colors next to each other affect each other. If you put a light white dot onto a black background, that white dot will seem larger, smaller than the same size dot in black on a white background. Context affects each other. If you are painting, the foreground makes you sometimes want to change the background that you did. Or you first paint the foreground and then you paint the background and you say, "Ooh, these colors, like they don't blend together exactly the same way that I wanted to. Let me change the foreground a little bit again," right? The idea that I'm getting at here is that games are continuous experiences. There are experiences that require context before and after what is happening. Whether that is, I have never played the game, let's get into the first level, let's try playing the game, or whether that means I am at the very end of the game, let's see what is the rest of the game that I have played, right? A game, just because you develop a vertical slice and the vertical slice is good, that does not mean that the rest of the game is going to be good, or that you are able to make the rest of the game, or that the vertical slice in any way can meaningfully guide you, because you might want to be able to come back to this section and you might want to be able to change it. One of the readings that I recommended inside of the research is from a book. It's a chapter. The book is about game design research, and like mostly it's like about academic research, but there is a chapter about experimental game design, about the idea of making games, like the act of creating them, the act of creating a video game as research. And there is a quote from there that I really like. The PDF of this chapter will be in the Masterclass Discord after we're done with this. So if you want to read it, it's like a 15-page read. It's beautiful, not directly related to this vertical slices, but it's something worth reading. And the quote reads, "The iterative design process is not always as straightforward as it is made out to be. But by the necessity, it is a rather messy process, going back and forth between several different tasks of creating, observing, and understanding the design," right? Like I said, when you're painting a picture, yeah, sure, you paint the foreground first, but then you paint the background, and the picture is not just it is more than the sum of the foreground and the background together. It is the harmony that is created between the foreground and the background. And that is why you need to go through this process of going back and forth. You need to be able to create the background as well. You need to be able to create level 3 to give you context for level 4, right? And you might want to sometimes be able to go back to level 3 and edit it because of the context of level 4, because you now have a different idea of what level 3 should look like. Vertical slices are extremely firm in their idea, right? It is the idea that you're gonna, essentially it's like saying, a vertical slice is essentially like saying, we're taking 10 minutes out of a movie and those 10 minutes alone need to be good, right? Those 10 minutes can be absolutely horrendous to watch on their own, but the context of the rest of the movie makes those 10 minutes good, right? Vertical slices in this regard like sacrifice this flexibility of being able to create bad parts that become good by the context that is around them, because they want reassurance. And it makes sense, right? Like it makes sense that we want reassurance, especially when we have investors involved, when we have somebody that is giving us money. These are people that want to know whether or not their money will be thrown into the trash can, or whether you are able to make good use of their money. So it makes sense that they want reassurance. But for art, when you're creating art, and games are, at the end of the day, a medium, and they are therefore art, vertical slices can kind of feel like a waste of time, and can kind of feel like you're locking yourself into an idea of what you will be creating without knowing if that creation will actually work. Because a good illustrator does not make a good comic artist. I can't, right? But like, let's imagine that I can draw a very good steel frame. That does not make me a good animator or a good comic artist that needs to contextualize that frame with the frames before it, with the speech bubbles around it, right? Just because you're able to create a good vertical slice, it does not mean that you're going to be able to create a good big game, because vertical slices are kind of like small games in themselves, right? That is what the whole vertical slice mantra is trying to teach you. It is trying to tell you, make a small game and then make it bigger, right? And ironically, I think this is why Rok asked me to do a lecture on vertical slices, because I make a bunch of small games that seem like they are fantastical vertical slices, right? And because they seem like, oh, let's take this game called Forward and let's make a ton more levels for it, right? But Forward, a game that is played like for 15, 20 minutes at best, is not a game like in its systems that exists. It is not something that can be stretched out to 60 minutes and then you can say, wow, I had wonderful 60 minutes. But you could, because it is in a small portion, say, wow, I had wonderful 15 minutes. Because you need to have systems that allow you to create like this flexibility. And being good at making small games does not make you good at making big games. I may be able to create systems that are good in small doses, in small experiences, when they have a small amount of elements. But that does not mean that having a lot of those elements will make the game better, right? Like, more is not always better. If we take a look at any sort of fighting game or any sort of like character-based game, whether that's something like League of Legends or a fighting game like Street Fighter 4 or even something like Overwatch, right? All of those games at one point had, like, Overwatch launched with 12 characters. When they added the 13th character, that does not make the game automatically better, right? Because that new element, the 13th element, contextualizes the rest of the elements as well. It changes the metagame. It changes how players play the game. And maybe the game was more enjoyable before they introduced the 13th character. I actually have no clue like how characters affect each other in Overwatch. I don't play the game, but like, you get the gist, right? Like, there is a reason why people still play Super Smash Brothers Melee, a game from 2003, which has 23 characters, as opposed to playing Ultimate, which has, more than 70 characters at this point, because they think that it's a better game, even though there is less elements inside of it, right? And vertical slices are kind of just small games. And because Melee works with 23 characters, you cannot say the game will be better when we have 50 characters on it. It might be, but we cannot tell for sure. So that is my whole pitch against why you should make vertical slices. But I told you why you should make them and why you shouldn't. So should you make them? I don't know, right? Like, it's not something that I can answer to you. It's probably also not something that you can answer on a whim by yourself. It is just a decision that you have to take. But you have to realize that games are complex. And they are made by people which are even more complex than games. And people are very different, right? Like, I am different than you are. And we think in different ways. And we create things in different ways. And we have to realize that vertical slices are simply just tools. They are tools that we can use inside of game development. And you don't need a hammer for everything, right? Sometimes having a shovel, if you're trying to dig a hole, is better than having a hammer. So you need to examine the sort of game that you're trying to make. You need to examine the team that you are inside of. And you need to take this context into account when you're deciding, should I make a vertical slice? And what are the systems that we actually want to make a vertical slice out of, right? and what are the elements that we want to include So I'm leaving you kind of like with a non-answer for the whole thing. I'm telling you it depends, because like all things in life, nothing is really simple, right? So I'm gonna leave you with a very vague piece of homework in the end as well, where I want you to take a game that you are making. You made a few weeks ago a game design document. You could use that, or you could use something like a video game that you're actually working on. Maybe you participated in Ludum Dare a few weeks, like 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago when it was, and maybe you made something that you really liked. You can take that, you can look at it and say, what is the gameplay loop and the meta loop, right? Like describe them first. Try to like do this descriptively. Do not try to break it down into systems. Then try to break it down into systems and write down if a system is a part of a gameplay loop or a meta loop, right? We could say we have a system of levels. That is the meta loop in Super Mario, right? Whereas the system of different character controls is a part of the gameplay loop. And write 2 features. They should say element. I wanted to at first call them feature, but I think element makes more sense. So write down 2 elements of each of these systems that you wrote down, so that you kind of have like an overview for what is the game that you're working with, and what are the loops inside of it. What is the meta loop of this game, and what is the gameplay loop inside of it, right? Like how do these things interact? And then lastly, examine this whole project, right? Like examine your team. Are you trying to get funding for the project? How long are you willing to work on this? How long do you want the game to be, right? And given this context, write down the pros and the cons of making a vertical slice for your game. And then hopefully this is enough of a tool for you, or enough of a framework for you to decide if making a vertical slice actually makes sense, or if you wasted 58 minutes of your life listening to me. But yeah, that's it. That's the end of the lecture on vertical slices, why you should and why you maybe should not be making them. Thank you for listening. We can go to questions if there were any through the lecture.
Thank you very much, Brin. Yeah, there is one question already waiting. Yeah, thanks for like beautiful presentation about vertical slices, and you said like why you should or why you should not make them. And yeah, let's go to the first question, and let's see.
Yeah, so Rosena asks, shouldn't a vertical slice be played rather than watched? It's hard to identify systems without interaction. I absolutely agree. I think you should be able to play vertical slices. I do want to say that a vertical slice is not necessarily a demo, right? So a vertical slice can be recorded, like for example, in the case that I gave of One Button Bosses, where we're actually developing the game and we're using a vertical slice inside of it, inside of publisher meetings and inside of platform investor meetings, we don't give them the game to play, because we did not design levels that are approachable and that are accessible by people who have not really played the game for a while, right? So we rather give them videos and we give them gameplay GIFs than something for them to play, right? We play the game, and we have some playtesters that are familiar with the concept and that play the game as well. But we do not throw the playable prototype at anybody who we're trying to get investment from. So when I was talking about watching or creating videos, the context for that would be that a lot of times, like especially because, like I said, you're trying to identify the interaction between a lot of different systems, you are creating the middle part of the game. A vertical slice is never level 1-1, right? Level 1-1 in Super Mario shows you like just a single element of the power-ups. It shows you the mushroom. But the power-ups, again, come into fruition when you have multiple on them, when you can contextualize the mushroom next to the fire flower, when you can contextualize it next to different enemies, which are not as easy to defeat as level 1-1 Goombas, right? So yeah, it should be played. Whether it should be played by anybody outside, that is not necessarily true, especially if you're working, like the kind of games that I'm working with are difficult arcade games, right? So if I give somebody a vertical slice or vertical slice that we were using for one button bosses, it was absolutely impossible for somebody to play it unless they were willing to like spend the first 8 minutes dying over and over. So yeah, they should be played, but again, remember the context. Context is important. Who is playing the game? And a vertical slice should not be a demo. It should not be something that is meant towards like beginning players, because you do want to play, like you do want to see the interactions of these systems, and you do want to see how they flow in their fullest potential, and then introduce those systems inside of like the first few levels. So Marco is asking, does a vertical slice necessarily need to be included in the final build of the game? Could it just be a contrived system, a segment that illustrates all the systems well, but it does not end up as any part of the game? That is true. That could be the case, right? So I was lucky enough last year to attend a beautiful lecture by a woman named Astrid Merfstup from Denmark, who is a CEO of Triple Topping. They made a game called Welcome to Elk, and they published and worked on Yinglet as well. These are two very well received, and for both of them, I think well sold as well indie games. And I know that a part of their process inside of their studio, they're a studio of 10 people, they create vertical slices, internal vertical slices that are not the final games. It is just something that they're using as feature freezing things, right? And they can afford to do that because they are a well-funded studio with 12 people with two very well selling commercial projects. I cannot, as a developer that works with 2 or 3 people at maximum, say to myself, let's spend months making a vertical slice that is going to exist only for internal usage, and then spend multiple months working on the game as well, right? So again, context is important. All of my answers here are kind of non-answers, but yeah, you could definitely do that. And I think it is like there is a phrase, kill your darlings, that you should be very well aware of inside of game developments, and you should very well be willing to throw things away. However, I will say that if you are looking at a vertical slice like this, it is not anymore a vertical slice of the definition that is traditionally seen inside of game development, right? Because that is iterative development, what you're talking about. It is making something that's saying, this kind of sucks, we can do better, and throwing it away, right? And often with publishers or with investors, you do not get this privilege, right? Like they want to see something that that is going to be inside of the game, right? The whole idea of the vertical slice traditionally is this is a segment from the final game. So I would say no, it doesn't need to be included in the final game. But then we're kind of going like straying away from this idea, and I think that's also like one of the reasons why like vertical slices kind of don't make sense in terms of like the investor developer relationships, because it seems silly to me for somebody to ask me, make a part of your game that is final and then keep working on the game for 2 more years. I will know so much more about the game in 2 more years, and I will have a very different relationship towards it in 2 years, and I will think about it differently, and I will be able to create better segments. Like that segment could be done so much better, right? So I would say, yeah, I will make you a vertical slice, but I will revise it later at some point, maybe like if it's like a pub investor and developer relationship. Gregor is asking, after creating the first vertical slice and setting in stone the rest of the game design, is it a good idea to keep development going by making vertical slices until the game is finished? So Gregor, could you clarify this for me? Are you talking about like making new vertical slices? So like keep going by segments like this? Or are you saying that you want to like, yeah, I guess like I contextualize it for myself, right? That is what you mean? Can you just like thumbs up or something? So I would say like it, again, like depends. Inside of one button bosses, what we did, like to give you an example, is that we made, yeah, okay, what you said, so perfect. So what we did was we created a vertical slice, and then we just worked on a bunch of levels. And we have like 15 different levels, a bunch of which we threw away, and we ended up with like, right now we have, I don't know, like 6 levels that we're kind of happy with, but we were just like, we just focused on levels. And then after like the levels are done, we're, for example, like working on the player attacks and the player movement, because that's just how we decided to tackle it, because we want the levels to dictate the rest of the systems that we have, because we think that's the most appealing part of the game, right? If you want the weapons to be the most interesting part of the game, if we were to say like, oh, we kind of like cared the most about what happens when the player presses the button, right? Like whether that's direction change, we could maybe first figure out like what are all of the different movement systems that we could create, and then make the levels around them. But we're kind of going in reverse, or like in the other direction, with making levels first, and then making the movement systems, because we want the levels to look spectacular, and we feel like it's a visual spectacle as well, right? So we are prioritizing that. If you're doing vertical slices like piece by piece, I could see like benefits in that, right? Like you could see like how all of the things are lining up together, and then see like the relationship between everything building up. But honestly, I think you should try focusing on one system that you see as defining for your game, right? And let that system dictate the rest of the systems. So go all in on levels, or the relationship meters that you have between different characters in your dating sims, or the building in like the ability to freely build buildings inside of sims, right? Like pick one system and focus on that system and try to make it shine. And then let the rest of the systems be dictated around this, because oftentimes games that have like oftentimes you will see that like you will remember a game not for all of its systems, but for parts of its systems, right? When I say Call of Duty and Battlefield, if you ever played those two first-person shooters, you will probably remember Battlefield from its like either destructible terrain or gigantic maps, right? And these are kind of the things that define Battlefield. Whereas Call of Duty is more or less defined by its weapons and more like by its like perk system, like the player customization. So again, it depends. It depends on what kind of game you're trying to do and what kind of things you want it to shine at. I could see like uses in this. The fact that like your game is always going to be more presentable if you keep doing vertical slices, I think is also a great thing when you're trying to attract, if you're trying to attract investors. But I would say, no, try focusing on one of the systems and then let that system guide the rest of them. But again, this is also from the context of me working inside of extremely small teams. And maybe when like you have 30 people working on a game, you keep the artist making the art, right? Like, and you keep the level designers making the levels, and you're not really jumping around everything. So hope that gives you some sort of a closure on this. So I could say, yeah, there's some uses in it, but I think it's better to let like one system take charge and lead the others. Okay, I have no clue how to pronounce this name. Gnorkul. Gnor, which is cool. How often do you use vertical slices yourself? Very little, I would say. And I think that is for the most part because most of my games are experiences that last a short amount of time. I have worked on like 3 games that are longer than an hour and a half. And in all of those games, in one of those 3 games, we have used vertical slices. And we are actively using them here in One Button Bosses, and here is where they are serving us well. But the other games were not really done with the idea of vertical slices, or they were done in the idea of verticals, like with vertical slices, with how Marco defined it, right? Where he said, oh, what if we just don't include this in the final game, right? A lot of times I made something where I said, oh, this could be a full game, a bigger game. And then I started working on the whole game, and I threw a bunch of the things from the original vertical slice away, right? Like it was more treated like a prototype that, besides just being a prototype of gameplay mechanics, was also a prototype of the final graphics, but then some of the like sometimes not, right? Like it's more like I more have like a prototypey approach, I suppose, right? Vertical slices is not something that I do often, but I think the bigger your team is, the larger the project, the more sense it makes to make a vertical slice. Or like I said, especially when it comes to like trying to seek investment, we found a lot more luck when we had a more proper vertical slice, or like a vertical slice with the +1 thingy. So not that often, but in the larger projects, in the more serious projects, in a sense of monetary value and having to have a team that is organized, I do make vertical slices. There's an off-topic question about one-button bosses. Yeah, it has very simple controls. There's a web build out there on my itch page or on Newgrounds that you can play on mobile. We are planning on bringing it there, but it's something that's like we are first trying to put it on Steam and Switch, because we know that those are platforms where we have way less competition than on the App Store and the Play Store, especially on Switch. And the problem already on Steam, that maybe a lot of you, like if you're interested in the game development, or if you have done any sort of economic research into publishing a game on Steam, is that a ton of games get published on Steam and that your game just gets lost everywhere. This is so much more multiplied when you go to the Play Store, which gets like thousands of daily app submissions, or when you go to the App Store, to Apple App Store, right? So yeah, it's a plan. But if you're making a game in this similar style that you feel like can work on mobile and PC at the same time, I think it makes more sense to first go for a audience, like for the platform that has less competition, and try to build an audience to it, because then you can get downloads and get views and purchases on other platforms from already creating a fan base on a platform where it's easier to create a fan base. We have a question from Snowball. You touched a bit on this, but is it possible, and also is it advisable, to switch production from prototype to vertical slice and vice versa? Again, it's like all of this depends on the context, right? It's like, and even if you gave me the context, I would hardly answer to this. I think, like, are you talking about like, as in, let's say that I'm prototyping and I like one part of the prototype, and I say, oh, I will take this part of the prototype and put it into the vertical slice. And then you're working on the vertical slice and you figure out, oh, maybe I need to change some part. Let's go back to prototyping. Because if you are thinking about it like this, I would say that this is advisable. If you are doing a vertical slice, that is kind of how you should be doing a vertical slice, right? You should be developing systems and like simple elements inside of those systems. And then when something doesn't work out, right? Like you don't really know if multiplayer is going to work inside of your game until you add multiplayer. Add multiplayer. Wow. So you add it in and you see, wow, this thing multiplayer really doesn't work. Let's throw it away, right? Or like you start off with a realistic art style, but you're trying to go for like a very cheerful game, and then you see like maybe like we're not really capturing the cheerfulness here. Let's go back to the drawing board. Let's prototype the art again. Let's try different types of art to see if they work, right? A vertical slice is kind of like a combination of all of the prototypes that you end up being happy with. So if you do an art prototype, you put the art that you're happy with in. If you do a gameplay prototype, you put the gameplay prototype into the vertical slice. But like in the prototyping lectures, like you were advised, you should be throwing away all of those prototypes, and you should just be building the vertical slice anew, right? So like if you know that jumping works in your game when you jump 3 blocks high, right? Or when you have a dashing ability or whatever, put that in the vertical slice and put the art in, and then see if they work together. And if they work together, great, like continue doing the rest of the systems. And if you see that no, like the art does not work with the dashing, obviously you go back, right? It's like making a vertical slice is making a small game. It's like making a game jam, right? What Josh told you is that prototyping is not like being on a game jam, because game jam is the whole game production thing in a very short amount of time. Well, vertical slice is a whole game production thing on a smaller scale, right? So you will be throwing away ideas while you are creating vertical slice, and you will be going back to the drawing board and prototyping. For example, we completely scrapped the camera system twice inside of one bosses and went back to the drawing board and prototyped different camera systems while we were making the game. And also, like, we like scrapped we like were prototyping, for example, a system that we were for sure going to have in the final game, which was this idea of having like multiple bosses on the screen at the same time. And then we were making the prototype and trying to put it into the vertical slice with like actual art and all of the effects going on, and we were like, no, this doesn't work, this is too much, this is like not something we want to have anymore. And we threw it away. But like the vertical slice for us like kind of functioned as a feature freeze, where we said we are not creating any new systems, we're just working on creating new shapes, new attacks from the enemies, and new levels, and then we're letting that dictate the rest. So I hope that answers it. So yeah, you should be switching it.
While we're waiting for a few more questions, I will ask like few of mine. How would you approach, let's say, a narrative game, a narrative vertical slice? What would you put inside a game, and what would you leave out? Let's say, for example, that you're going, let's say, for like some conference or like some play testing, and in the same process also for maybe like an open world RPG.
So these are like types of games that I absolutely do not make. But let's try. So like for a narrative game, I actually had like when as one inside of my notes for this talk, I have a few more examples that I was thinking of giving on game loops, on what are game loops. And I had a game that is a walking sim called That Night Stabbed by Blood River. It's free on itch. It's like this shader core game, incredibly beautiful. I highly recommend everybody plays it. It's like a 2-hour experience, not even an hour and a half probably, if you play it like at a normal pace and don't like look into every corner. But even as a narrative game, that game has sections, right? It has like a section where you are told a piece of a story, or where you're told a story, and then like it ends. The idea of narrative beats is very like frequent inside of storytelling. The idea that you have a start of a conflict, then you like work towards the escalation, and then post the escalation you have like some sort of resolution of that conflict, right? So it's like kind of like goes like like this, right? Like it's a triangle, and then like a whole story is composed by multiple different triangles, and you can try like doing a vertical slice out of this. Like to go back like to the meta loop of that game, right? Of That Night Stabbed by Blood River. I'll actually link it in chat. That Night Stabbed by Blood River. Give me a second. So to go back to that game separates itself into this kind of like rooms. It kind of has like a hub, right? And you could say that like a narrative game could be just a section of a story. Like it's one of these narrative beats, right? Where you're trying to capture some sort of a vibe. You could like apply this same like game loop idea to try to figure out like what should be inside of like a narrative game to a book. In a book, like a gameplay loop would be reading a chapter, right? And then like the meta loop is having like some sort of connection that leads you from one chapter to the next one, having like a cliffhanger at the end of it, right? Or just like some characters that were not mentioned in the previous chapter, like the progression of the story. So I would maybe try doing like 2 narrative beats and have that be like my vertical slice, where it's like you don't tell just one story. Again, like you try to do that second narrative beat as well, to show that there can be more depth to the characters than just like the simple narrative beat, that there is like more to explore about them. So I'd say it like that, maybe for a narrative game. And what was the other question for how would I approach that for something open world?
Yeah. So why I ask this question is because in a narrative game, like you don't want to like reveal the whole story to the player, let's say, I guess.
Yeah.
And in open world RPG, like there are like a lot of like systems that affect, and they're like, I don't know, like NPC systems, like, you know, like multiple regions, I don't know, crafting, whatever, like a lot of like system, and like how do you put them together? Yeah.
So like that's that's just a gigantic vertical slice, right? Like a vertical slice of, I don't know, Skyrim would be like exploring the area around the first town, right? Like having all of those systems, um, where it's like you have, I think, like wildlife animals in Skyrim that are walking around, right? But there's different animals that you can meet like in the snowy mountain peaks that you can meet like in the town side area. So you could maybe do like a section where you have like a few quests. It would just end up like you said, like it's very systemic driven games, right? And you would just end up having like a very thick vertical slice in the end, like or a very deep vertical slice, because you're working with a lot of different systems. But I think open world RPGs, like they especially like need that rule of like minimal amount of elements plus one, because it's the interactions of these different kinds of systems that really make them shine, right? If the only enemy that I can find in kind of Skyrim is a guard, and I can't really like and the only item that I can use is a health potion, that doesn't make Skyrim interesting. Skyrim becomes interesting when I have a basket that I can put on the head of a guard, which means that then I can steal like the bread behind the counter, right, without being noticed. So it's hard. I think like it makes sense why open world RPGs are notoriously hard to make and take like a very long amount of time to develop, because anything that is this much systems driven is going to require like the validation for when the system works only comes in when you have a few more elements. So you cannot just say, like you can in a racing game, let's make a racetrack, and then if it's fun to race with the car controller that we make, let's make 5 more racetracks, and we're gonna have a fun racing game with 5 more racetracks. Because they require, first of all, a lot of systems, and then on top of a lot of systems, the elements inside of the systems also need to be fun. So I would not make an open world RPG. That would be my answer. But I think you can make a vertical slice for it still, right? And probably when you are working on something that size and with like the teams that are making open world RPGs, you need a vertical slice as a thing that allows everybody to know what is the game that you're going for. Like getting to that vertical slice is going to be messy, and it's probably gonna involve a lot of prototyping and throwing away a lot of ideas. But everybody can then see like, okay, this is kind of what the final game will be like, except 10 times wider, right? So non-answer.
Yeah, no, that was good analysis, I think. And maybe last question from me, like maybe you touched a little bit about like how to approach investors and how to like make a vertical slice and so on. Like can you maybe like explain like how when you approach like somebody like a publisher, investor, whatever, like what would you do? Would you have like a pitch document and then like show the vertical slice, or like would you show vertical slice and then do a pitch, or how would that meeting go?
I can show you my my last pitch deck, because we actually had some platform investor meetings recently. Let me just maybe see if I need to hide anything on it. But no, so like again, context is king. So it's all about like who you're talking to, and it's all about like how can you make this good for them, right? Like how can you make it seem like you're doing them a favor by making this game, like how can they benefit from it. So give me just a second. Okay, whatever, I'll just like show this. I'm gonna is my screen still shared? Yeah, can you share it? Is it shared, Rock? I do not see the
yeah, it is.
Yeah, okay, great. So like for one button bosses, like on some of we were having meetings with Nintendo about getting like on their platform and like having some sort of spotlight on the store, and like have not had like positive relationships before. Like we tried doing like one pitch before through like email, and we got like a negative response for it, but this was like 9 months later now, and we were talking to different people. So the first idea was like quickly give them a brief of like what kind of thing we're expecting from them, so that they know like what we're talking about. And then it was about pitching the game, and it was about explaining the the game in like very simple terms and showing like some of the GIFs that I used inside of the presentation as well to like explain how the game works. And then because we do have a demo, which again is different than a vertical slice because it's friendlier towards players, we gave them a demo to play so that they could actually try out the game and they could actually play it for themselves, right? So that meant we created an experience that we're probably throwing away in the end, right? But we created an experience where the game slowly teaches you how to play it so that you can actually feel it, because we have such a simple game that we can actually do something like this. I think if you're making an open world RPG, which really shines when you can screw around in a town for 30 minutes, then it's a lot harder to do this, right? So it was about explaining the game and about pitching the idea and how the idea can be expanded upon, right? So we were telling them like, these are all of the cool things that we can do. Like we were giving them this imagination fuel, right? We were giving them this fuel for them to imagine what more we can do if only they give us some money, right? So then we went like into like a team presentation, because we're a small team, we can do something like this, and we can like play like a bit of a personal card. But the whole idea was like this. We were trying to make them imagine what we can do when we have money, essentially. That was kind of the pitch, and then we were asking them for a platform investment and kind of like what we would be able to deliver with this sort of platform investment. So it was about selling the idea and making their imagination spark. That's how I'm approaching these things. And I saw that like it's like because of this sort of experiences that I would say that like a vertical slice has like more than just the minimal amount of elements, becomes better for sparking imagination, both internally and externally, because we have seen like, especially externally, a lot more success within this. And I see that like when we have a vertical slice, it's also easier for me to talk to the other level designer on the team when we have multiple levels and when we have like multiple elements that we can reference to each other and look at and say, this is what a final like element should look like. So for publishers, investors, to keep it short, it was about selling them the imagination of what the rest of the game could be like. So it was in this case with a demo that they could play and with a bunch of GIFs from an internal vertical slice.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for this in-depth question and like sharing the presentation. Cool. I think there's no more questions in between. We're gonna slowly wrap this up. Brin, again, thank you for this
no worries.
presentation. Last few words. Next week we will have analytics lecture from Sarah Kirk. And yeah, as already Brin mentioned before, homework will also be posted on the Discord, and there will be time until Saturday, until 11. And I hope you see all on the next lecture, and have a great day.